So as you can see here, we'll be using Trapcode Particular to write with light, as we call it. We'll also have our particles go both in front of and behind the camera, which we've not done yet. So let's learn how to get this done. Let's create a new comp, call this motion path. And I need some type to use as the object for the particles to go in front of and behind. So I'm just going to copy this layer and paste it in here. This is simply a three-dimensional layer, pre-composed, that has some After Effects type in it. Notice that this is a 3D layer, so particles can go in front of and behind it. Next, I'll create a new solid for Particular. Call this the motion path. And we'll apply Trapcode Particular. Now what I'm going to do is use a light and emit particles along the path that the light moves. This is similar, but not the same thing as using a light emitter. These are two different things. So first, let me create a new light. Now, before I called this emitter, and I could call it emitter 1, 2, or 3, and I could use multiple light emitters in one composition. When I'm using this motion path setting, I need to call this motion path, and I could call this motion path 1 or 2. So if I hit OK, I go into my particular settings. I am not going to set this to a light emitter. The motion path settings are found in the physics section here under air. And right here we have a motion path that we can select, and I can set this to number 1. Now, unlike light emitters, we can have multiple light emitters with one use of Trapcode Particular. When we're using a motion path, we can only have one motion path light per one use of Particular. So we'll never have multiple motion paths used on one layer of Particular. But we can have multiple motion paths within a comp, up to 9 as you can see here. And I'll explain what the difference is between 1 through 9 and 1 through 9HQ. I'll just set this to 1. And now what's going to happen is that my light's motion path, or its change in position, that path will become the path along which particles will be emitted. So first I'm going to position this light where it needs to be. I'm going to have it move from off-screen right, swoop around, twirl around the text, and then go back off the screen. So I'll move this over in the x-axis. And I need to make sure it's in the right position in Z, so I'll set this to a custom view. We can see it's pretty far forward, so let me bring this back. Now we can see that as it comes behind the type, because the type is 3D, that the type is also being affected by the light. There's two things I can do here. Obviously, one thing I can do is twirl open this object here, go into the material options, and have it not accept lights. Which is kind of limiting, because if we would like some light effects on this, we will not be able to do that because we've totally turned off the ability for this layer to accept lights. Another thing that I often do is take this light, throw it at the very bottom, and turn on the adjustment layer switch for the light. What this is going to do is turn this light into an adjustment light. Now, because this is a light in After Effects, it is affecting our 3D objects, and it's also being used by Particular. So when we use an adjustment light, this will only affect layers below it. So if I remove this comp below, it'll be affected by the light. If it's above, it will not be affected by the light. So now at this point, if I wanted to add one more light for the type, and light that separately, I can do that. So if I bring this closer, we'll see a little bit of light variation across the face here. So we kind of get the best of both worlds. This light here is going to work for all these layers, but this light here isn't going to affect anything as long as we have no layers below it. So let's get this motion path where we want it to be. So it's going to be kind of over to the right and back in Z space a little bit. Now let's jump back to our camera view here and get that position where we need it. So it's going to start off screen like that and move over and swoop around the text. Now the first thing I need to do when using a motion path because I'm not using a light emitter, I'm using this light to define a path that particles will be born along. As those particles are born, we still have the option to use point or box or sphere emitter types. So I can have a single point, or I have an area or a spherical area along which the particles will be born. So as this path moves, we can have a point or an area around that motion path around which particles can be born. It's a little bit tricky. So first thing I need to do is align my motion path position with my emitter position. So right now, these are my starting positions for my motion path. And I'm just going to dial in some even numbers here to make it a little easier. And I'll go into the motion path here and type in those same numbers. So again, all I'm doing is just aligning my emitter and my motion path. We don't have to do this, but it makes life a lot easier, and it's a lot easier to understand where things are going when these 2 points are aligned in 3D space. So now, if I move this motion path, I'll set just a couple keyframes here. And what I'm going to do is turn the velocity down. The particles are being emitted along this path, but they have a velocity of 100, so they start moving quite rapidly. If I turn this all the way down to 0, we'll see that the particles are following the path of this light right here. If I set this to something like a box emitter, you can see that now the particles are being emitted in an area around that motion path. So I can expand the area of this area of emission just by adjusting the area of the box. So we have sort of two separate controls. We have a path and we have an emission area, or emitter type box area that we can define. So it's a little bit tricky, but gives you a lot of control over creating light paths like this. For now, I'm just going to set these emitter sizes to 0 and leave this at a box emitter. So from here, it's a matter of me drawing out a motion path that goes behind and in front of this type layer. So I'm going to do this by switching to a custom view and changing my angle here. Okay, so now I've got my keyframes all set up. If I jump to a different view here, we can see that the particle path is kind of twisting around and it is going behind and in front of the space of the type, but it isn't quite set up just yet so that the particles appear to go behind it, but in the physical space, they are actually going behind it in Z space. Let's jump back to my camera view here. Now, to smooth out the speed of this, because I have these sort of not quite equally spaced, and this particle path is going to sort of speed up and slow down, I'm going to select these middle keyframes and set them to rove across time. So this will keep an equal velocity as this light moves from this point here to this point here. That's exactly what roving across time does. So we have our motion path going like that. And we need to have this actually appear to go behind the type layer. So if I go into my particular settings here, at the very bottom I've got this visibility section here. We have a setting called obscuration layer. The point of this is to be able to define a layer, and the particles will be able to appear to go behind that layer. That's exactly what an obscuration layer is. So if I set this to particular comp 1, which is my type layer, it's going to do a couple things here. It's going to create a light called obscure, turn off the visibility, and lock it. That's normal. This is how it works with After Effects to get this done. Now, as you can see, as this light path moves behind the type and in front, the particles now appear to go behind and in front, which is really cool. Now, as you can see, if you look very closely, The edges of this are not anti-aliased. This actually uses sort of a Z-buffer approach to it, and Z-buffers are not anti-aliased. But by and large, that's how we'll get this done, is by using this obscuration layer. Within one use of trap code particular on one layer, we have two obscuration layers that we can use. And the second one is going to be a wall or floor layer that we've defined with our bounce system. But I'm just using one obscuration layer so that the particles can go behind this type here. So let's do a quick preview of this. This will play out. So let's tweak the look of this a little bit. Go into the particular settings here, go to particle, and I'll make this a kind of a bluish, and turn up the sphere feather just a little bit more. Now, one more element I'm going to add, because we do have a light moving around here. It would be great to add sort of a particle head right here at the tip. So as this light path is riding on, we can have another little cluster of particles here trailing some sort of stars and kind of a pixie dust effect along with it. So to do this, I'm going to use a real light emitter like we've done before. So if I create a new light, and I call this emitter, and I'll create a new solid for my second instance of particular. So this will be the just the regular particles that will go along the writing edge of the motion path. So I've got my particles there, and I'll apply particular. I'll go in here to my emitter section and set this to a light emitter. So now this is using this light right here to emit my particles. So what I'm going to do is have this light follow the position of this light. Because the way particular works, I have this emitter light named emitter and my motion path light named motion path. I cannot share these two paths together. My emitter light needs to be called emitter, and the motion path light needs to be called motion path. So to have these share the same path, I'm simply going to connect these two positions with a very simple expression. I'll hold down the Alt key, or Option key on the Mac, and grab this pick whip right here, and drag it down to this position here. All that's going to do is write the necessary code that I would otherwise need to type out as an expression to tell this position to follow this position exactly. So now this emitter position is following the light path exactly. Now, if these are not in alignment, go to the very first frame of your comp and double check that your motion path position here and your motion path settings on particular are the exact same settings. We should have the same X, Y, and Z values for particular as your motion path. And if these are out of alignment, you'll see that your two light emitters will not be in alignment. So just jump to that very first frame and make sure that they are indeed aligned. So now I have a second layer of particular following along right here, and I can do all kinds of fun things with that. I'll set this to a glow sphere. We'll turn the life down so that these are not living quite as long. In fact, this can be about a half a second or so. I'll set the size over life so that these fade out. Just tap the tilde key and have these fade in size, and also have them fade out in opacity. Let's turn the size up just a little bit. And let's add some size randomness here. Now, to change the color of these particles, I have this option to set it at the birth, but you'll notice that this is grayed out. We're using a light emitter, and if you'll remember, because light emitters use After Effects light, it's going to use the color of the light itself to define the color. So this color right now is white. If I go into the light options here and change this to a blue, the particles are now going to become the color of that light. I'll go back to my particle settings here, set the transfer mode to add. I'll add a little bit of color adding in there. And I'm also going to turn on the aux system for these and emit particles from these particles here, from the main particles, and add a different type of particle. So right now I can change this particle type to a star. So these spheres that are being emitted will also emit little stars as they move along. And we'll have this inherit the color of the main particles. And I'll turn the lifespan down. We don't need these on screen very long. And also turn the particles per second down so we don't have so many of these stars in here. Now, these all share the same rotation value. So, unfortunately, we don't see in the aux system here, we have no control over the particle rotation in the aux system. That's actually buried in the options here with the aux system. So I can set a rotation speed here in the aux system section to add a little bit of rotation to these particles as they're being born. So let's do a quick preview of this. Now, just a couple things I need to tweak here. As you can see what's going on as this emitter light is moving around, we can see that the 3D layer of the type is being affected by that light. So now you can see the results of using this light emitter and not correcting for the fact that this light will affect all the 3D layers in it. So I'll do the same thing, make that an adjustment light and move it to the bottom so it will not affect any of the other layers. Also, these stars, I have not set any sort of fade in or out. So I'll set the size over life to trail out over time, as well as their opacity. So now as they dissipate away, they'll be fading and scaling away. So as you can see, using a motion path as an emitter is very powerful and can yield great looking results. One thing I should point out, in this motion path option here, I mentioned we have these HQ settings and these normal settings up here, 1 through 9 and 1 through 9 HQ. I'm going to set this to motion path 1 rather than motion path 1 HQ. Now, what you can see when I set it to motion path 1 is that the edges start to get a little bit jagged. And this is simply because we're seeing a limitation of the frames per second in our composition. Now, what I could do is go in and change the frame rate to smooth this out, because the more frames we have, the smoother this will get. Let's set this back. But a better solution for this is to simply take advantage of the fact that built in to the plugin is this HQ option. Now, this HQ is basically a high quality option that will smooth out any jagged results that we'd have due to the fact that our motion path is fast enough that we can see the results of the individual frame rendering here. So if I set this to 1 HQ, it smooths out the motion path and gives us a much cleaner result.